through the spirit of St. Augustine, on this 34th Sunday of Ordinary Time, Year A, we celebrate the solemnity of Christ the King. The three readings presents to us a common theme, the kingship, which takes its full realization in the person of Christ the King. In the first reading, Ezekiel presents to us an image of God who descends to become a good shepherd that cares for his flock. In the second reading, St. Paul points out that the name of Jesus is above every other name. But why do we consider Christ as the King? Christ is considered to be King because of the kingship he inherited from his Father. Which kingship? The kingship in relation to self-giving love, that is to say, a leader who lays down his life for the sake of his people. In addition, implicitly, Christ is King because he accepted it during his trial before Pontius Pilate. On the same note, at the time of Jesus' trial, the Jews viewed a king as a political, rich and ready leader who could engage in wars with other nations. However, Christ's kingship is not of this sort either, but rather it is the spiritual sort of kingship that is anchored on service, love, care, and protection. In order to understand this parable in the Gospel of today, let us divide it into three parts. The description of Jesus' second coming, verses 31 to 33. The dialogue with the righteous and the accursed, verses 34 to 45. The final judgment, verse 46. In the first place, let us start with Jesus' second coming. Jesus will come escorted by a host of angels. Thereafter, sit on the throne of glory, ready to pass judgment. The first step that Christ will do is to separate. He will separate people according to what they would have done to the least in the society. But one may ask, where does this notion of separation come from? In fact, there are two explanations for this. One, a cultural reason. Historically, in Palestine, every evening the shepherd could separate sheep from goats based on their behaviors so that they may pass night in two different places. The second reason is more biblical. In Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 17 to 23, there we find the image of separation also much developed to mean the right hand side for the righteous, whereas the left-hand side for the wicked. With these two sources of inspiration, Christ applies it in the parable and will apply it too on the last day to judge us. The next step after separation is to interrogate. Here we have the dialogue of Christ with the righteous, thereafter the wicked. Essentially, this dialogue reveals that on the last day, Christ as judge will use the following two important criteria to judge us. These are love and truth. First criteria is love. This concerns our relationship with one another as well as God. That is why Jesus in this parable gives us an example of the 6 corporeal works of mercy. But then, the Catholic Church teaches us that there are 7 corporeal works of mercy. Wait a minute, where does the 7th one come from? This is how it is. When one lacks the 6 named in this reading, one becomes vulnerable, therefore qualifies to be the least. When there is no one who comes to aid him or her during this vulnerable condition, logically one dies. Consequently, when one dies, a burial follows. Therefore, the church gives us the seventh corporeal works of mercy as to bury the dead. Anyway, whatever we do to the less privileged in our society determines whether we shall have access to heaven or to go to hell. Christ the King identifies himself with the poor, the hungry, the prisoners, and all the less privileged in our societies. Therefore, some simple gestures of love to the least of our brothers and sisters means that one will have access to the right hand of Christ on the last day. The second criteria that Christ uses and will use to judge us is truth. At the end of time, when we would have gathered before him, the truth of what we have done and what we were expected to do and we didn't do it will be known in the broad daylight. Our life story could be compared to a scene of playback moment, or what is referred to in literature as flashback. Indeed, Christ in this parable flashbacks the lives of the two groups of people who are completely surprised of the happenings. Firstly, the positive surprise for the righteous because they did good things to the least of their brothers, but they did not know how good it would be. Secondly, the negative surprise for the wicked at the left-hand side of Christ, simply because they did nothing to the least of their brothers and sisters during their lives. In fact, as we heard from the Gospel of last Sunday, the last servant who received 1 talent and did nothing with it. Anyway, I imagine a great surprise to some of us at the final judgment, particularly when those expected to be at the right-hand side of Christ are not there, and those expected to be at the left-hand side of Christ are not there too. Which group of people would you wish to be identified with? The final step that Christ uses and will use on the last day before admitting us to heaven or sends us to hell is to judge us. Based on the gospel reading of today, Christ as King uses 2 criteria to judge us, that is love and truth. On the other hand, what we do to the least of our brothers and sisters, we do it unto God. In addition to that, through this parable, Jesus is reminding us to take seriously the corporeal works of mercy in this life now. It is an urgent call to every one of us. In fact, we can say that to share our goods to others is not an option, but rather a collective task to all of us. What do you do in order to serve Jesus Christ in the poor? Do you recognize him frequently in those in need? As we celebrate the solemnity of Christ the King, let us keep in mind that Christ will come again, as we often affirm in the Creed. Indeed, he will come back to judge us the living and the dead. He will judge us collectively, but each person will account for his deeds. To conclude, according to this parable, Christ uses and will use these steps before letting us to join heaven or hell. The first step is to separate us. The second step is to interrogate us. And final step is to judge us as either to go to heaven or to go to hell. He who gives to the poor gives to the Lord. Proverbs chapter 19 verses 17. Have a blessed Sunday on this solemnity of Christ the King.